Good evening, everybody. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services at New Canaan Library. On behalf of the library, I want to thank our partners for their contributions and assistance on this important programming series. Our speaker this evening, Dr. Justene Hill Edwards, is a scholar of African American history, specializing in the history of slavery in the United States. She is currently an assistant professor of history at the University of Virginia. Professor Edwards received her doctorate in history from Princeton University in 2015. She also holds an MA in African New World Studies from Florida International University and a BA in Spanish from Swarthmore College. Professor Edwards' first book, Unfree Markets, the Slave's Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina, will be released in April 2021 by Columbia University Press. This evening, Professor Edwards will discuss the history of slavery in New England. Thank you for being with us this evening, Professor Edwards. There will be time for Q&A following the lecture, so we ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. It's the one that says Q&A, and we're going to be fielding all of the questions through there. Professor Edwards, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Anthony, for the introduction, and thank you again for inviting me to this virtual event this evening. So, this is one of my favorite topics. I am, as Anthony said, a historian of slavery in the US. And even though my own research focuses on the South, I'm still deeply interested in the history of slavery in New England. And so I am excited about sharing a bit of this history with you and about having a hopefully vibrant Q&A afterwards. So as I begin, I want to encourage you to take a moment, a few seconds, and to think about the first images that come to mind when you think of slavery in America. Hopefully you can all see the screen. Do you think of a plantation? Perhaps the image of plantations in the South come to mind. This is actually a picture of the main house of one of the largest sugar plantations in Louisiana during the 19th century. Or maybe you think of cotton and the enslaved people who labored on cotton plantations. But what about this? This is an advertisement from the Boston Gazette from July 1729. It is announcing that a slave ship named the Charming Betty would be arriving with, quote, fine young Negro slaves, end quote, and that anyone interested in purchasing the enslaved African men and women, probably boys and girls as well, could purchase them using hard or real money, or purchase them using lines of credit. The merchant, his name was Godfrey Malbone, after whom a street in Newport, Rhode Island is actually named today, would put the slaves on display at his wharf for a slave auction in Newport. So interestingly, if we look at the history of slavery in the early United States or in the colonial period in particular, we're not only looking at the evolution of slavery in the colonies such as the Carolinas, in Virginia, or even in Georgia. We are also looking at the development of slavery, really the evolution of slavery as an institution in regions of the American colonies that comprise New England. So this evening, I'm going to discuss this history, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which slavery, specifically in Connecticut, in New Hampshire, in Rhode Island, and in Massachusetts, again, the colonies that comprise New England, evolved, and how the experiences of the relatively small population of enslaved African men and women shaped the development of slavery and shaped many of the ideas that we associate with slavery in the South writ large. And so when we think of these types of pictures, these types of images of plantations and of cotton in particular, we often think that they define slavery in America. But if we take a step back and if we look at the entire history of legal slavery in the colonial period and during the period in which slavery was legal, really from the moment of first contact when enslaved Africans were brought to colonial America in 1619 from the end of legal slavery in 1865. And then we are actually looking at the existence of slavery in the colonies that make up New England. So, to begin, the New England colonies were connected to a wider world, an Atlantic world of goods, of people, and really of commerce. The triangular trade, as historians like to call it, represented a movement of goods, of human captives from West and West Central Africa, also called Atlantic Africa, across regions of the Atlantic world. Trade routes that connected, again, Atlantic Africa, South America, the West Indies, mainland North America, and Western Europe. And so African slaves essentially were shipped from Africa to regions of the Americas, regions of the New World. And goods were shipped, such as molasses and sugar and rum, to regions of British North America, specifically for our purposes to New England. And so we have a whole host of products that are making their way around the Atlantic world, trading on the West African coast for slaves. Slaves were brought to island colonies in the West Indies. If we're talking about the British Atlantic world, we're really talking about Barbados in the 17th century and Jamaica in the 18th century. And then from there, we have those goods including human captives, African slaves being brought by traders to regions of mainland North America, colonial America, in addition, regions of New England. And so we have this interesting connection of trade with New England farmers and merchants really being tapped into this trade. And so interestingly enough, if we think about the emergence of the Atlantic world, the merchants and traders in these New England colonies were tightly tuned in and honed in to this world of commerce and trade. Interestingly enough, these same colonists and investors who were investing in sugar plantations in the British West Indies were these same merchants, entrepreneurs, and investors who were colonists in regions of colonial America, such as Boston and Newport. And so we have prominent New England merchants and traders, such as the Winthrops, the Hutchinsons, the Shrimptons, and the Mavericks, who had financial and familial connections to plantations in the British West Indies. And this is what that meant. That meant that New England colonists were intimately connected to the success of slavery, and in particular plantation-based slavery in the colonies in the British West Indies. So it was not uncommon for these English families, these investors essentially, to send their sons to learn the trade of plantation and slave management from the island colonies in the Caribbean, come back and bring that knowledge with them to continue this familial tie to Atlantic commerce and the Atlantic slave trade. And again, colonists in New England were very aware of not only African slavery, but the vast wealth that was being generated and created from the Atlantic slave trade in general. And so all of this is to say that African slaves were brought to New England early in the region's history. And so while Puritans arrived in what is now Massachusetts in the 1620s and 1630s, the first recorded instance of enslaved Africans in New England was in 1638, so fairly early in this period. And a small number of African slaves were brought to North American colonies to labor on plantations, but in particular in New England, African slaves were brought to labor on small farms and to serve in the households of increasingly wealthy and prominent members of New England society. So this small group of African slaves that were first brought to New England in 1638 were actually traded for Native Americans captured in the Pequot War in the 1630s. And so it is important, again, to note that these first group of enslaved Africans were brought as a result of these intimate connections, these intimate commercial connections that England traders were developing and establishing with plantation colonies in the Caribbean. But in the process of fighting Native Americans were also enslaved and captured and sold to the West Indies, while African slaves were brought to serve in the households of prominent New England businessmen. So what this means is that it may be easy to believe that African slaves were the only form of labor. Well, that's not true. There was a time in the early 17th century when English colonists were choosing between essentially white indentured servants and African slave labor. But with the dangerous and harrowing conditions of labor in these colonies, they had a hard time luring white indentured servants to labor for a period of 5 to 8 years in these colonies. And so it became fairly simple to transition into using African slave labor to fill labor needs in these burgeoning northern colonies. And again, English traders and colonists were following the Portuguese and the Spanish, who began to establish trading relationships on the Atlantic African coast beginning in the 1440s. It was not until really the 1550s and 1560s when the English began to cultivate trading relationships with elites on the Atlantic African coast. But after the mid-16th century, English traders continued to invest quite heavily in not only the profits of slave labor, but they began to use those profits to invest in growing and expanding their plantation enterprises in the West Indies, bringing those slaves with them to regions of New England. And so interestingly enough, we see the foundations of slavery begin quite early in New England's history. And interestingly enough, if we look at this history of slave laws in particular, again, it may be easy to associate the evolution of slave laws with slavery in the plantation South. But if we really look at the history of slave laws in colonial America, we have to begin not in a place like Virginia or South Carolina, but we have to begin actually in Massachusetts. And so the first law to recognize the legality of slavery occurred in Massachusetts with the Massachusetts Body of Liberties in 1641. It was based off of the Magna Carta, interestingly enough, and it was with this statute that lawmakers in the colony of Massachusetts ratified this law to legalize and recognize the legality of slavery. And so that is to say that Massachusetts is this first colony to reflect on the status of slaves and codify, in a way, the enslavement of people of African descent primarily, and of course, Native Americans as well within the colony. And so interestingly enough, we have this language here. It's a bit old, but I think we can read through it. It begins here. There shall never be any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars. This part is in bold. And such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And so the language here is fascinating because we have colonists and colonial administrators kind of taking a passive stance on slavery. If slaves were sold to them or sold themselves into slavery, which is interesting, then slavery would be illegal. But despite this language, this is the first statute to recognize the legality of slavery in colonial America, and it takes place, it is ratified in Massachusetts. And so if we transition a bit from the 17th to the 18th century, we have a growth, not just in the population of these colonies, but in the growth of the quote unquote Negro population. And it is in the 17th and the 18th century when the idea of Blackness and the idea of a Negro becomes tightly associated with slave. And one of the reasons is because of the increasing numbers of people of African descent who are enslaved in the American colonies. But if we look at the colonies in New England in particular, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, we see a steady population growth. And so between 1700 and 1740, the population of Rhode Island, for example, grew from 543, you'll see here one of the arrows, to 2,408 in 1740. Now, this may seem like a small total number, but the jump is quite dramatic. That is a 343% increase in the slave population of this one colony. And the years of the greatest growth of the slave population in these four colonies in New England was between 1700 and 1750. Interestingly enough, we see the same, well, not the same, a similar population growth. We see population growth writ large in colonies such as Virginia and South Carolina in particular. And so even though enslaved Africans never reached more than 20% of the population of New England in the 18th century, we do have to see these numbers as though being indicative of the investments that enslavers and slave traders were making, not just in the institution of slavery, but in the slave trade writ large. And so if we kind of look at this graph and take a look at the kind of steady growth, we again see that there were increasing numbers of enslaved Africans being brought to the colonies of New England between 1640 and 1780. And this is because of natural increase, enslaved women giving birth to enslaved children, but by and large this was because of the influx of slaves being brought into these colonies by slave traders, and slave holders therefore purchasing slaves to live with them in their households. But interestingly enough, if we compare Massachusetts to colonies such as Virginia, the numbers show a different story. And so if we compare 1670 to 1780, kind of right in the thick of the Revolutionary period, we see a difference, right? And so in 1670, there were about 2,000 slaves in Virginia compared to about 160 in Massachusetts. And we see this number growing steadily. So that by 1670s, there were over 140,000 slaves in Virginia compared to a little over 4,800 in Massachusetts. And so by the 1770s, slaves were about 40% of the population of Virginia, while they were just about 2% of the population in Massachusetts. And I say all of this to say that even though slaves were only 2% of the population in Massachusetts, does not mean that they did not attempt to create coping mechanisms to deal with just the brutality of slavery in general in this period. And so then if we look at the populations of a few other cities in New England, specifically Newport and Boston in the 1750s, we see an interesting difference, which really tells us about the role of slavery in these cities. Interestingly enough, Newport was one of the most bustling slave trading ports in colonial America, being eclipsed by perhaps Charleston, right? And so we have in Newport in the mid-18th century, specifically in 1755, approximately 1/4 of the population of Newport was Black, and most of those were enslaved. And so we have 25% of the population of Newport being primarily enslaved Africans. Africans. Compare that with Boston, which is about 10% of the population in 1752. Again, 10% is not a large part, but it's significant enough that shows us that there was a visible Black population, certainly in Boston, of course, in Newport. Interestingly enough, we can compare these numbers to a place like Charleston, South Carolina, where enslaved Africans in the same period of time comprised between 60 to 70% of the population. So again, comparing 60 to 70% is different than 25 and 10%, but still, there were enslaved Africans in cities in the colonial period that typically are not associated with slavery. And so we have enslaved Africans and a small number of free people of color, specifically in the 18th century. And again, even though they were not a large share of the population, their presence, their work, and their experiences had an indelible influence on African slavery and the development of colonial New England. If we look at the slave advertisements, they show a whole host of information, right? They show us these cities where slaves were being auctioned off. Again, we have Boston and Newport. They show us the year 1763. One of those years where the population was increasing in cities such as Newport and in colonies such as Rhode Island. But what this means, though, too, is that there were kind of vibrant, there was a vibrant economic life around the institution of slavery, such that there were advertisements for slaves, right? We have here on the left, Gold Coast slaves comprising of men, women, boys, and girls that were being sold at auction coming from the Brig Royal Charlotte. And then on the right, we have again a public auction of a likely Negro man in good health. The good health part of that is very important. And so again, slavery was a part of the commercial life in these cities. And to ignore that is to ignore an important part of this story. And that is why, just as enslavers in the southern colonies did, slaveholders in New England pursued their runaway slaves with the same intensity. Runaway slave advertisements, both of these coming from New Hampshire, show us that, that enslavers sought to recoup their investments in slave labor. These slave advertisements went as far as to describe the disposition of certain enslaved people, how they looked, how they would comport themselves in public. And again, this is from the 1760s. And so as you can see, these slave advertisements, these fugitive slave ads represent the reality that even though slavery in these colonies, in these cities may not have had the same tenor, perhaps not the same numbers as in the colonial South, enslaved Africans still attempted to get one thing that they desired the most, and that was their freedom. And oftentimes when they could, they escaped in search of their freedom and emancipation. And so, but it is clear that escape was difficult, and the difficulty of enslaved men and women escaping their status as slaves really reflected the nature of slavery in this region in the colonial period. Interestingly enough, though, most enslaved men and women were clustered in trading towns and port cities such as New London and Newport. And again, interestingly enough, Rhode Island had one of the largest populations of enslaved people. But all of this means is that enslaved men and women had very unique experiences with slavery. And in Connecticut in particular, slavery and slaveholding had a certain amount of social status attached to it. And so enslavers were mostly businessmen, ministers, and doctors. And so in Connecticut, again, in 1774, half of all ministers, half of all lawyers and public administrators, and a third of doctors owned slaves. And 2/3 of these estates valued at more than 2,000 pounds owned slaves. And so in these colonies in colonial New England, slaveholding was associated with wealth, it was associated with status, and for some enslavers, to own a slave was a sign of status. It was a source of conspicuous consumption. To own a slave meant that you had wealth and status and could spend the funds on an enslaved person. And it is worth saying, I'm not going to talk about it in this talk in particular, but it is worth saying that even some of the oldest colleges and universities have deep, deep ties and connections to slavery and the slave trade. Institutions such as Brown, as Yale, and Harvard can trace their history and profits to slavery and the slave trade. And so enslaved Africans in New England were in service of enslavers who, by and large, were not purchasing more than 1 or 2 slaves. This is what historians like myself like to call an intimate form of slavery, not intimate in the romantic sense, but intimate in the fact that that many enslaved Africans lived with the people who owned them, lived in the same household as their enslavers. And so what this means is that enslaved men and women were kind of forced to comport themselves in certain ways in terms of their proximity to the people who own them, to their enslavers. And so as white colonists began to invest more and more in the Atlantic economy of slavery, in shipbuilding, in slave trading, in distilling rum, Newport had some of the highest numbers of distilleries in colonial America. It meant that enslaved Africans became a more valuable commodity in these New England colonies. And so it means that the intimacy of slavery between enslaved men and women and their enslavers was kind of at the heart of slavery in these colonies. And so this is an example of this perceived intimacy. This comes from Ebenezer Parkman, who was a minister from Westboro, Massachusetts, and he's writing in 1729. He's mourning the death of Maro, his enslaved man. He says, "God is still the strength of my heart and my portion forever, but dark as it has been with us, it is much darker at or about the sun setting. The sun of Maro's life sat, the first death in my family." So I want to draw your attention to the last 2 words here, my family. Interestingly enough, enslavers in the South in the 19th century would often refer to their slaves as a part of my family. My family, black and white, was a common term that enslavers used. But interestingly, we see that there was a longer history here, and it could stem from colonies such as Massachusetts and enslavers there, slaveholders there. We have Parkman kind of writing this eulogy to Maro, talking about the first death in his family, feeling as though Maro was a part of his family. Now, interestingly enough, we can flip this on its head, right? We can ask, well, what would Maro have said about that relationship? Would he have felt the same familial affinity to Parkman as Parkman did for him? Of course, we can't know this, but it is an interesting thought experiment to pose this question, considering Parkman's choice of words and his very effusive remembrance of Maro as his slave. So we have this idea of intimate slavery, right? Enslaved men and women living in close proximity to their enslavers. One of the most revealing historical figures that talks about the intimacy of slavery, but also the challenge of slavery, was a phenomenal woman named Phillis Wheatley. And if you have not heard of Phillis Wheatley, I hope that you take some time to do a bit of research on her, because she's fascinating. So Wheatley was the first African-American female poet published in the US. She was the first person of African descent and the first slave to publish a book of poems, as well as the third American woman to do so. She was captured from modern-day Senegal and Gambia, and was enslaved in New England to businessman John Wheatley. She lived and worked from the age of 7 with the Wheatleys, who lived in Boston. And she was essentially the slave of Wheatley's wife, Susanna. Phillis Wheatley proved to be a prodigy. We would call her not just precocious, but a genius. She learned English fairly quickly, even reading the Bible within a few years with amazing fluency. Though she did not completely avoid working as a domestic in the Wheatley household, she did use her spare time using Susanna Wheatley's tutelage to learn Latin and Greek, reading classic text from Virgil and Homer, in addition to poets such as John Milton. And so we can kind of position Phillis Wheatley within this history, and she was by and large a prodigy. She was a poet as well, as I said, and these words really exemplify her talent. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind, while yet OD'd ungenerous they disgrace and hold in bondage Afric, blameless race. Let virtue reign, and then accord our prayers, be victory ours and generous freedom theirs. This is called On the Death of General Wooster from July 1778, right in the thick of the American Revolution. And you can see here, she is in some way talking about Africans held in bondage and ideas of freedom that are kind of swirling in this revolutionary moment. And so she was emancipated by the Wheatleys at the age of 21. And in this period of time in her young life, she gained transatlantic popularity, even corresponding in 1776 with George Washington. She counted French Enlightenment writer Voltaire as a fan of hers. And so though Wheatley was an exceptional historical figure and really an exceptional case because she was this prodigy, we can learn a few things about her experience as a young enslaved woman in 18th century New England. She wrote about how she did not have memories of her former life with her former family in West Africa, and her poetry really revealed these very fractured and fraught feelings living in Massachusetts with a white slave-holding family. Her life shows the complications of the realities of freedom for the formerly enslaved. And so even though she was well published, even though she had garnered, again, transatlantic attention and attention from the highest ranks of American society, unfortunately, she died in poverty. Yes, she got married to a free Black Bostonian named John Peters, and they lived a life together in Boston, but she died in 1748, attempting to earn a living from her writings while free, but she could not translate her brilliance into a comfortable life for herself and her family. And so when Wheatley, again, was attempting to find her footing in freedom, other people of African descent were finding their kind of complex path to freedom as well. And that was through this complex and challenging process called gradual emancipation. And so gradual emancipation began towards the tail end of the American Revolution. And in theory, it was supposed to be this shining moment of freedom for the thousands of enslaved Africans in the colonies north of Pennsylvania, including Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. But in these colonies that were transitioning into being states, gradual emancipation proved to be more challenging than emancipatory. And we can look at Connecticut as an example. And so in Connecticut, the legislature passed gradual emancipation in 1748. And so as of March 1st, 1748, children born to slaves in the state would not be a slave after the age of 25. And Connecticut lawmakers actually rejected gradual emancipation proposals 3 times prior to actually ratifying this one in 1748. They rejected the proposal in 1777, 1779, and in 1780. And so by the terms of this 1784 law, no one individual slave would gain freedom from bondage prior to March 2nd, 1809. And even then, only those born after 1748 could be emancipated. And so even though enslaved people are kind of swept up in the rhetoric of freedom and liberty that is so much at the foundation of the American Revolution and the founding of this nation, enslaved men and women in colonies and in states such as Connecticut were struggling to realize their own freedom. But this meant that enslavers could emancipate slaves, and there were enslavers, slaveholders that did. This was called postnatal emancipation. But gradual emancipation statutes did not immediately emancipate any enslaved person. And so in Connecticut in 1790, interestingly enough, the slave population numbered just over 2,700. It decreased by 66% over the next decade. And so we see a gradual dwindling of the enslaved population by enslavers freeing their slaves. And by 1800, there were 951 slaves in Connecticut. Interestingly enough, though, slavery was not officially abolished in Connecticut until 1848. And so you still have this period of time where there still are slaves in colonies and in states such as Connecticut. And so what does this mean? What does this mean for the realities of enslavement in women? It meant that in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, gradual emancipation was a very slow and gradual process. Enslaved men and women fought to protect their children's freedom, often with slaveholders who were at times timid about ensuring that their children would eventually be emancipated. But gradual emancipation proved to be a pathway for enslaved men and women to gain freedom if their enslavers cooperated, if their enslavers went through the legal processes of emancipating their slaves. And so if you'll notice, I haven't really been talking about Massachusetts when it comes to gradual emancipation. And that was because slavery ended in Massachusetts in a very spectacular way. And it has to do with 2 historical figures. One of them is named Elizabeth Freeman, also named Mum Bett. Freeman was born in 1741 to enslaved parents in New York. At the age of 6 months old, she was purchased along with her sister by a man named John Ashley from Sheffield, Massachusetts, whom she served until she was 40 years of age. She was then known as Mum Bett, and she had a daughter whose name was Little Bett. Her husband had been killed while actually fighting in the American Revolution. So one day, her mistress tried to hit Mum Bett's sister, in a heated kind of exchange, and Mum Bett intervened and received the blow instead. She was furious. She left the house and she refused to return. When Colonel Ashley appealed to the law for her return, she called a local lawyer. His name was Theodore Sedgwick. He was a lawyer from Stockbridge who had anti-slavery sentiments. He agreed to help her sue for her freedom. Sedgwick agreed to take on the case, in addition to another case from another one of Ashley's slaves named Brom. And so Sedgwick brought this case to a local court, suing for the freedom of Freeman and Brom. This case is called Brom and Bett v. Ashley. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the two enslaved people, freeing them from their enslavers and actually ordering Ashley to pay them 30 shillings and their legal costs. So essentially she won her freedom. And in this case was kind of one step closer to realizing the end of slavery in Massachusetts. Interestingly, Elizabeth Freeman had a kind of a stellar family. She died in 1829 as a free woman, and interestingly enough, one of her great-grandchildren was African-American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois. So we see this case as being a big step in the history of abolishing slavery in Massachusetts. The kind of death knell of slavery in Massachusetts was a case called Commonwealth v. Jennison. It was decided in 1783. In July of that year, slavery was essentially abolished in Massachusetts with the ruling of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. This is also known as the Quock Walker case, and it involved an enslaved man named Quock Walker who essentially sued his enslaver for his freedom. The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that he was free because the judges used the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights and stated that all men are born free and equal, to argue that not only was Walker to be emancipated, but to claim that slavery was officially abolished under the Massachusetts Constitution. So not only was Massachusetts the first state to legalize slavery, they were the first state from the American colonies to officially abolish slavery. And so the transition to an environment where slavery was visible, to an environment where slavery was slowly being phased out, provided enslaved men and women, and largely people of African descent in New England, with an opportunity to kind of express their freedom in public ways. And they did this by forming active political organizations based on ideas of community and ideas of racial uplift. And so in conclusion, as Northern colonies and then states transitioned into members of the new nation, free Black and recently emancipated Blacks found ways, again, to create community. And so one of the first mutual aid, really the first mutual aid society created in the US was founded in 1780 in Newport. And the organization was comprised of formerly enslaved men and women who lived in Newport. And again, this was the first African-American benevolent society in the US created to help guide former slaves out of slavery and into freedom. And it is in cities such as Newport and colonies and states such as Rhode Island where, again, slavery took hold, but these were the first colonies as well, and then states to begin to untether themselves from this relatively long and entrenched history of slavery and therefore ideas of race in colonial America. And it is worth saying, as a final point, interestingly enough, Rhode Island is a fascinating state to study in terms of slavery. And as of June 2020, and so as of June of this past year, the name of Rhode Island was officially changed. Previously, and for its entire existence, it's been Rhode Island and the Providence Plantations. And the Providence Plantations part has been taken away from the official name of the state, and now it is just Rhode Island. But all of that is to say that this history is fascinating. Here, let me not do screen share anymore. This history is such a fascinating topic to explore. And there are ways in which slavery has so much of a more entrenched history in these northern colonies and states such as Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire than in any other state. And it is important to understanding this broader history of not just slavery, but race in America at large. So I look forward to all of your questions. All right, let's see. Okay, so I'm going to answer a couple of these questions. Anthony, I guess you can feel free to just pop in. Okay, let's see. This is from Sandra Limeburner, hello. Where would New England slaves go to escape to become free? Where would they go? Well, it was not uncommon for enslaved Africans to actually seek refuge with Native American communities and really kind of stake claims farther west. And so that was not an uncommon occurrence at all. Let's see. It is interesting that Christian ministers, this is from Cleo Bybas, hello. Cleo Bybas, yes. It's interesting that Christian ministers saw it proper and ethical to own slaves. How did they reconcile that with their Christian beliefs? Yes, this is a big question. And in some ways, Christian ministers did not see slave holding as being in opposition to their religious beliefs. They just did not. And so in many ways, some Christian ministers actually saw their positions as slave holders as being part and parcel of their ideas of themselves as following Jesus and being Christian. And so in their minds, these two ideas were not separate, but in some ways were mutually constitutive. Okay, let's see. What was the origin of the word Negro? That is, I believe it may come from Latin, but I'm not quite sure about that. Let's see. Did the intimacy of slavery, this is Sarah Correa, hello. Did the intimacy of slavery play a role in why the North became the first part of the country to seize slaves as human beings and grant them freedom? Okay, two parts to this. I often push back when I hear my students, for example, say that slave holders did not see slaves as being human, because I'm not actually sure that that was the case, right? If we kind of step outside of just the intimacy of slavery between enslaver and slaveholder, an important part of understanding the evolution of slavery, even in these northern colonies, were that there were interactions, relationships, either coercive, enforced, or entered into willingly by both parties. There were intimate relationships between enslaved men and women and white colonists. And so to see the proliferation of biracial and mixed children suggests to me that perhaps the humanity part was more kind of complicated. But I do wonder too, though, yes, if one of the reasons why these northern colonies were kind of the first to expedite this path to freedom. And I think one of the reasons why is because there were smaller numbers of slaves in states such as Connecticut than there were in Virginia or South Carolina. So I would not be surprised if that were a part of the calculus as well. Let's see, what else? Let's see, where did those that were given emancipation go? This is a great question. Increasingly, you see former slaves attempting to kind of stake claims to the cities and towns in which they lived. And so there were increasing populations of African Americans in Newport, in Boston. Some traveled south to Philadelphia, and Philadelphia actually became, both Philadelphia and New York became kind of hotbeds for political activity in terms of anti-slavery activism that drew free and emancipated Blacks to those cities to participate in these larger political campaigns to end slavery. Let's see. Is there a comprehensive book on slavery in Connecticut? I'd have to take a look at that and get back to you. Please email me about that. The first book that comes to mind, actually, when I think about Connecticut in the colonial period is legal historian from Harvard, Bruce Mann, also the husband of Elizabeth Warren. His first book is about kind of the legal history of Connecticut. And so I don't recall if there is a part about slavery. I would not be surprised, but please email me and I will do a bit of due diligence in finding you a book, because it is fascinating, I'm sure. Let's see. Ooh, Jane Himmel. Can you speak a little more to the impetus for the process of moving to emancipation, and so gradual emancipation? Was there a link to changes in the economic structure, and who were the primary proponents and leaders of this effort to end slavery? Okay, this is a great question. And so I think that there is a cynical and a not cynical way to approach this question. I think a not cynical way is that the ideas that were being espoused and fought over in terms of the American Revolution really took hold. And it forced enslavers, in particular in these northern colonies, to rethink their investments in slavery and holding human property. And so there were a number of enslaved men in particular who fought on the side of the patriots in the American Revolution, and many of them got their freedom by fighting these in these conflicts. And so I think that was a part of the calculus as well. And I think too that particularly in these colonies and then states, slavery had kind of ceased to become as economically viable. The actual cost of slave holding was quite large, and so I would not be surprised if many enslavers sought to divest themselves from their direct investments in slave holding. That is not to say that they were divesting themselves of investments in slavery. Okay, Spencer Schubert. Can you talk generally about how you think public schools are doing with educating children on the history of slavery? I love this question because I teach courses on slavery. I've taught a course on the legal history of slavery, which I find fascinating. I'm teaching a course now on capitalism and slavery. And I constantly have undergraduate students saying that their minds are blown by, for example, knowing that Massachusetts was the first state to legalize, or a colony, excuse me, to legalize slavery. And so what that tells me is that perhaps our schools, both public and private, are not focusing enough on this history, because there is a way in which it is so integral to understanding the evolution of the United States as a set of colonies and then a nation. There is much to say about the economics of the country and how slavery was integral to the growth and kind of spread of this even idea of manifest destiny that begins to emerge in the 19th century. And so, yes, I think I do have to say that unequivocally, the education with regards to the importance of slavery is probably not what I, as a historian of slavery, would like it to be, because I'm having consistent conversations with students whose minds are blown about how prevalent slavery is, especially in kind of northern colonies. They often think of it as a southern thing, but to learn that it was not is mind-blowing to them. Would the presence of Quakers up north have anything to do with earlier emancipation? Quakers, yes, especially in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the first state to ratify gradual emancipation, and that was because in the 18th century, Quakers in Pennsylvania had began to have very fervent conversations about morality with regards to slaveholding. And so they started encouraging their members to divest themselves of slavery for moral reasons. And so certainly in colonies and in states such as Pennsylvania, that was a major influence on the ratification of gradual emancipation. Were from Rachel Rogers, were freed slaves sometimes re-enslaved? Your question comes at an auspicious time, because I was actually just reading about this in the context of Solomon Northup's narrative. He wasn't a slave, but it's still kind of within the conversation. This becomes an increasingly fraught question in the 19th century, especially in 1850, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And so there was this fear, especially in cities such as Philadelphia and New York and Boston in particular, of slave catchers re-enslaving freed slaves and enslaving free Blacks. And so, yes, this was kind of this prevalent fear that in many ways we could say was one of the catalysts for the Civil War. Okay, let's do two more questions. Let's see. All of them are great. Ooh, okay. Since I work first and foremost on South Carolina, I'm going to read Mary Moran's question. Just finished reading Denmark Vesey's Garden. Speaks to South Carolina's defense of slavery in the Civil War by pointing to the North's hypocrisy, particularly Rhode Island. To what extent did the cotton gin contribute to the continuation of slavery in the South? How close was the South to ending slavery before that invention? Okay, so the cotton gin was this kind of created this new phase in slavery in the US. It kind of collided with Jefferson's negotiation with Napoleon for the Louisiana Territory, which occurred at the beginning of the 19th century. And so with the advent of the cotton gin and the kind of dramatic, quick doubling of the US, there was just a re-entrenchment of slavery. Do I think that the South was close to ending slavery before that invention? I really don't think so, because enslavers were looking to kind of expand their investments in land anyway. But it certainly kind of lit a fire, and it kind of quickened the expansion and entrenchment of slavery, certainly. And two, it's worth saying that slavery, that even though slavery began to kind of die a slow death in the colonial North, Northern manufacture and capitalists and investors were deeply connected and invested in slavery, in slave-grown cotton, because much of the gin cotton coming out of states such as South Carolina and Georgia and Louisiana and Mississippi were being sent to mills in places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So we're talking about interconnected economies, certainly. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, policing and slave patrols. That is a great question. The 13th Amendment, the immediate creation of prisons of slavery. Yes, I typically end my American slavery class with that. It's a question of whether slavery has actually been abolished. Let's see. At what age did children that were born into slavery actually begin working for the families? This is an interesting question. This will be the last one. And this kind of gets to the heart of the difference in the type of slavery, the kind of nature of slavery in New England. And so because most slave holdings were smaller, if an enslaved woman got pregnant, to an enslaver in a colony like Connecticut, that enslaved woman was seen as a burden, and that enslaved child was seen as a burden as well because the child was unproductive. But if we transition to the South in a state or a colony such as Virginia, that calculus changes. It means that the enslaved woman has just borne an asset that goes directly to that enslaver. And so they could have begun working at the age of 4 or 5 or 6. And at that point, when they're children, when they're babies, older female slaves would traditionally kind of take care of the slave children. So yes. All right, so many great questions. Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but please feel free to correspond with me via email, and I'll see what I can do about continuing this very great conversation.
Thank you, Professor Edwards. It was wonderful.
Thank you.